At 2:13 a.m., two Su-35s flanker aircraft recently acquired by the Venezuelan Air Force took off from the Francisco de Miranda Air Base with afterburners engaged at 8:25 a.m. Venezuela time. They generated 14,500 kilo of thrust per engine, accelerated down the 3,200-meter runway, and reached a rotation speed of 280 km/h in just 18 seconds before climbing at a steep 32-degree angle. Each aircraft was prepared for an air combat patrol mission with lethal armament. The armament included an IBC radar system, considered one of the most powerful in the world, capable of simultaneously tracking 30 targets at distances of up to 400 kilometers, 2 R-70 missiles and 3 R-77M medium-range missiles with a range of 110 kilometers. Over a 23-minute span, these two Su-35s directly confronted 4 U.S. Navy F-18s Super Hornets patrolling international airspace 180 kilometers north over the Caribbean Sea. What began as a routine identification intercept would become the first real confrontation between Russian and U.S. fourth-generation plus aircraft since the end of the Cold War. Two Venezuelan pilots, each with $75 million homes equipped with the most advanced technology Russia could export, were shot down by aircraft that were technically inferior in several respects. A series of tactical errors, poor decisions, and fatal misunderstandings turned what should have been a training mission into a disaster that would cost 2 lives and redefine the aerial balance in 190. The response does not refer to technological advancement, but rather to pride and the false belief that sophisticated equipment can compensate for a lack of real combat experience. 52 days before the meeting, Venezuela had received the first 4 Su-35s aircraft from Russia as part of a $600 million military agreement that included housing, flight simulation systems, 3 years' worth of spare parts, and most importantly, a 12-week training program with Russian instructors at Miranda Air Base. For the Venezuelan Air Force, the Su-35s represented an enormous qualitative leap compared to the 1980s-era F-16As and the Su-30 Mk2s, which, although capable, were a full generation behind the Su-35 in terms of avionics, radar, and electronic warfare capabilities. It is an exportable fighter model developed by Russia in direct response to Western fifth-generation fighters, such as the F-22. Although it isn't truly stealth, this is compensated for by an extremely powerful radar, thrust vectoring engines that allow Western pilots to maneuver with ease, and the ability to carry up to 14 air-to-air missiles, a capacity no Western aircraft can match in reality. The specifications were impressive: a maximum speed of Mach 2.25, a service ceiling of $20,000 meter, a combat range of 1,600 kilometers, and an IBIS-E radar. This radar can detect targets with a radar cross-section of 3 missiles at distances of up to 400 kilometers and track 30 targets while simultaneously guiding 8 missiles to different objectives. In 1900, Venezuelan pilot Andrés Condor Salazar, chosen to command his squadron of 35 Su-30s with 1,900 flight hours, had spent 8 weeks. At their new base, Russia is receiving intensive instruction. The Russian instructors had repeatedly emphasized the capabilities of the IBIS-E radar, explaining that in a hypothetical engagement against Western aircraft, the ideal strategy was to detect first, fire first from maximum range, and exploit the superior range of the R-77 missiles, which in theory outranged the American AEM-120 AMRAAMs by 10 kilometers. Salazar had fully absorbed these instructions and believed that with the Su-35, by maintaining distance and exploiting the radar and missile range advantage, he could defeat American aircraft in one-on-one combat. The Russian instructors had not sufficiently emphasized, or perhaps did not fully understand, that equipment specifications are only one component of modern air combat, while tactical training, combat experience, and integration with early warning and electronic support systems are equally important, if not more so. On October 12th, a routine training patrol was scheduled. With a total of 680 hours in their Su-35, Salazar and his senior partner, Ricardo Jaguar Torres, would fly north over the Caribbean, performing several simulated combat maneuvers before returning after 2 hours. The flight plan had been filed with air traffic authorities and indicated that they would remain within Venezuelan airspace and the Air Defense Identification Zone, which extended 200 kilometers from the coast. They didn't know that the aircraft carrier USS Harry S. Truman was operating in international waters 320 kilometers north of Venezuela, while the 4 F-18 and the Super Hornet from Strike Fighter Squadron 105 were conducting their own air combat patrol mission. Sarah Vixen Meitel, commander of the Super Hornets, with 2,400 flight hours, including 500 in actual combat over Syria and Iraq, where she had flown 73 combat missions, led the Gunlinger flight. Lieutenant Commander Marcus Blade Chen, Lieutenant Jake Smoke Rodriguez, and Lieutenant Ashley Reaper Thompson were part of her formation, all with over 1,000 hours of Super Hornet training and real combat experience. The Venezuelan and American pilots differed considerably in their level of experience. Salazar never launched a missile in actual combat. He has never been hit by an enemy missile. However, Meitel and his team executed him dozens of times, and he never performed evasive maneuvers while someone was trying to kill him. At 10:03, Salazar and Torres were 190 kilometers north of the Venezuelan coast, flying at 11,000 meters and at a cruising speed of 850 kilometers per hour. When he activated his Urbis-E radar in long-range search mode, the system detected 4 contacts flying at 230 kilometers at an extended formation speed. Salazar felt his pulse quicken as he reviewed the information. On the touchscreen, the contacts showed a speed of 900 km/h and an altitude of 9,000 meters, roughly the patrol altitude. Torres's transmission. I have 4 enemy contacts heading south at 230 km. Although there was no state of war between Venezuela and the United States, and the contacts were in international airspace, Salazar considered any U.S. military aircraft near Venezuela to be a potential threat. Salazar didn't know that when he activated his radar to emit high-intensity electromagnetic pulses, Mitchell's RWR system immediately detected the emissions. The Super Hornets had an ANALR system that, based on frequency, pulse pattern, and emission characteristics, could identify the type of radar illuminating them. The system computer immediately identified the signal as coming from an IRBC radar connected to 30Y5 and, based on the sphere's intensity, calculated an approximate distance of 240 kilometers from the emitter. Mitchell informed his crew, saying, "I have an Urbis spike, and to the south at 240 kilometers, probably a Venezuelan flank, to keep MCON in line." MCON, short for emissions control, indicated that the Super Hornets would use passive sensors and early warning data from the E-2D Hawkeye orbiting 120 kilometers behind them to track targets. This was a common tactic in the Navy because keeping the radars off made it harder for the enemy to detect and track the Super Hornets, while the Hawk, with its massive rotating radar, could track threats at 400 kilometers and transmit data to the house's emission computers via the Link 16 data link. Salazar was fascinated as the 4 contacts drew ever closer, reaching 180 kilometers over the next 7 minutes. His training had told him he had to report this to ground control, but part of him wanted to see how close they were before turning away. Venezuelan operational doctrine was clear. Any foreign aircraft approaching within 150 kilometers had to be intercepted, visually identified, and escorted out of the area when radio warnings went unanswered at 160 kilometers. Salazar made a decision that will change everything. Ground control transmission to the Caracas station of Corps Uno. There are 4 unidentified connections approaching the air defense zone. Request permission to intercept and identify. Previously, the controller responded after an 8-second pause that seemed to last an eternity. You are authorized to intercept Condor 1, maintain a safe distance of 20 kilometers, and never initiate a conflict. Confirm. Salazar replied, confirming. Intercept. Keep your distance. Don't start conflicts. A Condor emerges. About that, he communicated a modified plan to Torres. We will intercept these contacts. Join me and maintain a tight formation. Salazar executed a left combat turn, banking the F-35 at a 60-degree angle, yanking the stick and applying 4 Gs, which slammed him against the seat. Moving 800 meters to the right and slightly back into a mutual protection position, Torres followed this maneuver. While keeping the radar active, Salazar pushed the throttle forward and accelerated to 100 km/h, Mach 1.1, just above the speed of sound. Meanwhile, he tracked the 4 contacts at 140 km/h, and they quickly converged at a combined speed of 2,100 km/h, When they were traveling at this speed, they covered 60 kilometers in 2 minutes, which means that if they continued on the same course, they would be close to them in less than 5 minutes. The tactical computer aboard Mitchell's F-18 now showed 2 additional contacts approaching from the south. The I-2 Hawkeye had detected the subs and the 5 when they took off and had been passively tracking them for 20 minutes. Via Link 16, it was continuously transmitting data to the Super Hornets. Mitchell watched on his screen as the 2 flankers accelerated and moved directly toward his formation. At first, it was clear they intended to intercept the identification. They transmitted 2 flankers to their formation, which accelerated toward us from the south. Currently, probably 130 kilometers. Routine interception, maintaining formation, and if approaching, carrying out standard identification procedures. Subsequently, the international emergency frequency was changed and broadcast in Spanish and English by all military facilities. Venezuelan aircraft were approaching from the south, while US military assets were flying in international airspace on a training mission. We are not the representatives of the threat. Keep a safe distance and verify intentions. Salazar paid attention to the transmission. It reflected a combination of joy and learning. He was aware that he was right. They were US aircraft, probably Super Hornets, based on the formation configuration their radar showed. US aircraft, this is the Venezuelan Air Force. You are approaching Venezuela's air defense zone. Visual identification required. Get ready to be caught. Maintain your current course and speed. In response, Emit was firm. Negative. Venezuelan aviation. We do not accept any interception request, as we are in international airspace and 190 kilometers from your coast. We will maintain our current heading. I suggest they return to their own airspace. Salazar made the second fatal decision of the day. He transferred control of the country, believing it was under Venezuela's control. The US residents refused to identify themselves and continued to approach. I request approval to take defensive measures. 3 senior officers, including a division general and an air defense commander, had quickly gathered around a tactical situation display in the air defense control room in Caracas. 4 encounters between the US and Venezuela took place in international airspace, each with legal authorization. The general was aware that allowing US assets to operate unhindered near Venezuela, including fire control, radar illumination, and weapons preparation, could be interpreted as a hostile act that would worsen the situation. Moreover, he also knew that allowing these facilities to operate without hindrance would project an image of weakness. He had just made a decision that many analysts would characterize as politically motivated, but with disastrous tactical consequences. Response: Condor 1 has been authorized to take defensive measures. Execute an aggressive intercept profile. However, do not activate weapon systems without additional authorization. Affirm. As he selected his 6 R-77M missiles from his weapons panel, Salazar confirmed with a sense of authority. He hadn't armed any weapons, but had merely prepared for a quick attack in case the situation deteriorated. At 10:15, the 2 formations were 80 km apart and closing at speeds that would bring them within missile combat range in less than 3 minutes. Mitchell made a crucial tactical decision. She ordered Blade and Smoke, 2 of her Hornets, to activate their APG-79 radars in air-to-air mode, while she and Reaper kept their radars off, acting as hidden shooters who could strike if the situation turned hostile. The U-35's RWR systems immediately detected the high-power pulses transmitted by the Super Hornet radars. Salazar interpreted this as preparation for an attack when he noticed his screen lit up by 2 fire control radars. They had been taught in training that when an adversary illuminates you with a fire control radar, they are ready to launch a missile and you have only a few seconds to react. Their training did not sufficiently emphasize that in modern US Navy operations, keeping some radars active while others remain passive is a normal tactic designed to saturate enemy warning systems, although it does not necessarily imply preparation for an imminent launch. Salazar committed his mistake. He panicked at the radar lights and activated his own fire control radar without obtaining additional authorization. He switched from search mode to high-resolution tracking mode, which provided him with the precise targeting data needed to launch missiles. The Super Hornet systems detected this immediately and radically changed the nature of the encounter. Mitchell saw on his screen that a flanker had switched to fire control, which, according to the Navy's rules of engagement, was considered a hostile act, warranting a defensive response. He transmitted in a calm, professional voice as he bombarded the flank in hot pursuit mode without weapons. Everyone agrees that the hot swap meant changing the actual combat status. Unarmed pistols meant they were free to disappear if there was a threat. As they selected their targets and prepared to launch, the 4 pilots quickly confirmed. Salazar saw that his radar was showing 4 enemy targets today, all of them odd and eccentric, at a distance of 62 kilometers, well within the range of his R-77Ms, which had a published range of 110 kilometers and a practical range against maneuvering targets of about 80 kilometers. Torres's transmission. I'm making contact with the leader. I'm ready to fire at my mark and demonstrate opposition. The missile lock-on process began when the Urbis E radar locked onto Mitchell's lead Super Hornet. He calculated the distance, speed, and altitude, and generated a firing solution that was transmitted to the missiles in Mitchell's cockpit. All the alarms blared a piercing 1200 Hz tone. A missile alert appeared in the headphones and a Venezuelan contact warning on the screen. It was completely shut down, and the estimated launch time is unknown. Mitchell was firm. After carrying out a lot of real combat missions, I knew that when an opponent locks onto your missile and you're in the combat zone, you shouldn't wait for it to disappear. Fox 3 is launched with Lugan's Free Fox 3. He then pressed the release button twice, which resulted in the launch of 2 AEM-120D AMRAAMs at an interval of 1.8 seconds. The missile's rocket engines ignited instantly, accelerating them from 900 km/h to Mach 4, approximately 4,800 km/h, in Mino and Posip in 5 seconds. Also, the other 3 Super Hornets simultaneously launched 2 8-missile AMRAAM salvos, converging on each other at a distance of 60 kilometers. Salazar was dismayed when his warning system detected missile launches and his screen filled with red icons indicating 8 threats approaching at impossible speed. He felt a moment of paralysis before his training kicked in automatic responses, and he shouted at the incoming missile towers. "Evasive maneuver!" he shouted as he yanked violently on the control stick, executing an 8G upward turn that pinned him to his seat. Simultaneously, he pressed the countermeasures launch button and released 36 cartridges of infrared flares and reflective material packets designed to confuse missile seekers. However, the AMRAAMs used a high-resolution active radar, which was much harder to fool, especially at short ranges. Torres performed his own evasive maneuver, turning in the opposite direction to try to break away from Salazar and draw the attacking missile's attention. However, with 8 AMRAAMs converging from slightly different angles, it was unlikely that both of them would evade. The first AMRAAM turned towards Salazar and changed course using a submarine evasive maneuver. Its radar seeker had activated at 15 kilometers, allowing it to achieve a solid lock on the large metallic target that was generating a radar return impossible to conceal. Salazar continued executing sharp turns and changing direction, trying to break the missile's lock, but the AMRAAM was more agile and could execute a turn. Salazar knew there was no way out when he saw the missile's smoke trail approaching 3 miles away. Last message transmitted: Condor Tower 1. Before the Ambra impact, at 10:18:42, exactly 2 minutes and 11 seconds earlier, I was under attack by US missiles. After the first launch, the 18 Kian fragmentation warhead detonated 5 mm from its target, sending 3,000 tungsten fragments that pierced the left side, severing hydraulic lines, destroying control surfaces, and penetrating the fuel tank. It began to move uncontrollably as the spilled fuel ignited, forming a plume of orange flames that was visible from 30 kilometers away. Salazar fought with the controls for 4 seconds to regain control, but the plane failed. He reached for the ejection handle between his legs and pulled with all his might, so that a jolt separated his seat from the airframe. From an altitude of 800 meters, he watched as his $35 million 75-ton aircraft spun toward the ocean, impacting the surface at 900 km/h and disintegrating into a cloud of debris and burning fuel, while the ejection seat rocket propelled him upward after a 2-second freefall before the main parachute deployed with a violent jolt. Torres didn't fare any better. At 35 years old, 3 AMRAAMs were assigned. The first one missed, passing 120 meters away because Torres had executed a perfectly synchronized evasive maneuver, but the second one struck directly into his central fuselage. At 10:18:51, the explosion was catastrophic and destroyed the central section of the aircraft, where the main fuel tanks held 8,000 liters of highly flammable kerosene. The temperature of 100 grams of C4 caused a fireball that expanded 40 meters in all directions and consumed oxygen. When the cockpit disintegrated, Torres died instantly, falling in dozens of burning pieces that struck the ocean across a square-kilometer area. As a Super Hornet Mattel formation was forming, Torres observed on his radar that both contacts disappeared from the screen, replaced by the fragmented returns characteristic of destroyed targets. Transmission to his formation: flanks destroyed, 2 bandits down. Stay alert for any additional hazards. Check the amount of fuel available. He calculated that they had enough time for an additional 40 minutes of patrol before being forced to return to the aircraft carrier. He reported the situation to the Hawkeye controller and changed the command frequency. Our new crew members sustained no damage as 2 Venezuelan flankers were destroyed in self-defense after being illuminated by a fire control radar. We are requesting instructions. The controller replied, "Bravo, Gonslinger. Maintain your current position and await orders from the 7th Fleet." Salazar descended by parachute for 18 minutes and landed in the ocean, 2 kilometers from where his house had been hit. He activated an automatic life raft and an emergency transmitter that began broadcasting a distress signal on the international frequency. He floated in 1-meter waves for 3 hours and 22 minutes before being rescued by a Venezuelan search and rescue helicopter. When he was lifted into the helicopter, he was in physical and psychological shock and was shaking uncontrollably as they wrapped him in thermal blankets. During the flight back to base, he remained silent, staring blankly into space, imagining that his comrade Torres had died, that his $75 million home had been destroyed, and that he had survived alone. Fortunately, the ejection system functioned correctly, and the subsequent analysis by the Venezuelan military command identified multiple critical errors that contributed to the disaster. First, Salazar escalated the situation by activating a fire control radar without official authorization, turning a routine intercept into a deadly conflict. Secondly, he had grossly underestimated the difference between codified equipment specifications and the actual combat situation, where tactics, training, and experience are more important than minor technological advantages. Third, he, who had no support from early warning systems and relied solely on the radar at his post, was operating when the Americans had aging Hawkeyes that provided them with a complete tactical picture of the battle space, allowing them to make decisions based on additional information. Fourth, and perhaps most crucially, he mistakenly believed that controlling the first shot guaranteed victory. In reality, it has given Americans a clear legal argument to respond with lethal force. The strategic impact of the incident spread rapidly among the military communities of several nations. For Venezuela, this meant the loss of 2 of its most advanced facilities just 52 days after receiving them, as well as Motinoción, the death of an experienced pilot, and the capture of another pilot, who would be subjected to extensive interrogation about the submarine's capabilities and limitations. The direct economic cost of both aircraft was $50 million, in addition to the incalculable political cost of publicly demonstrating that state-of-the-art Russian equipment was superior to the older generation US aircraft operated by more experienced pilots. For Russia, the incident was a public relations disaster that undermined export campaigns for the Su-35 to other potential countries, which would now question whether the caça could truly face Western threats, as Russian propaganda had promised to the United States. The outcome reinforced existing doctrines about the importance of training and experience over equipment specifications. Subsequent analyses showed that the U-35s technically had advantages in several areas: a more powerful radar, a greater weapons load, and thrust vectoring engines, but that these advantages were completely negated by the superior tactics of the US pilots, who kept 2 F-35s in reserve with their radars off, confusing the Venezuelans about the actual number of aircraft they faced, by integration with 2 Hawkeyes, which provided situational awareness the Venezuelans lacked, and by combat experience, which enabled Mitchell to make the split-second decision to fire. When Salazar hesitated, Commander Mitchell was interviewed 2 weeks after the incident by the Navy's Lessons Learned analysis team. Her response was that real combat experience is the factor she considers most important for the outcome. It is explained that in modern aerial combat, you have only a few seconds to assess the threat, make a decision, and act. If you hesitate, you'll die. Pilots who have flown real combat missions have developed incredibly powerful instincts that cannot be learned in a simulator, have experienced the real fear of attacks, and have learned to function effectively. That being said, they made mistakes in training and exercises, but these mistakes had no fatal consequences, which allowed them to acquire knowledge that would later serve them in real combat. He compared this to Venezuelan pilots who, although they had the technical skills to fly their aircraft, had never operated under real combat pressure, where a mistake leads to death rather than a lack of training. Salazar was finally released in a humanitarian exchange 7 weeks after the incident. After returning to Venezuela, he was subjected to a court-martial for his involvement in a conflict initiated without proper authorization. He was found guilty of abuse of authority and negligence, which resulted in the death of a fellow officer, but received a relatively mild sentence, a 3-year suspension with community service instead of prison, due to the trauma of the experience, the recognition that tactical errors had been the result of inadequate training and political pressures rather than deliberate malice. Throughout the rest of his military career, he worked in administrative positions and never returned to combat duty. Approximately 10 years later, he acknowledged that he had been egocentric and believed he could compete with American pilots because of his superior aircraft. He reflected that, while processing information and trying to make decisions for other countries' air forces, technical specifications are irrelevant when facing professionals who have fought in real combat dozens of times and know exactly what to do in every microsecond of combat. The incident with the Su-35 learned a lot about the reality of contemporary aerial combat. First, sophisticated equipment, while important, cannot be used as a substitute for intensive training and combat practice. Secondly, integration with support systems, such as early warning radars and tactical data links, is essential for combat effectiveness, as it provides a situational advantage that can offset the technical disadvantages of individual platforms. Third, doctrines and tactics should be developed based on actual capabilities, rather than on advertisements promoted by equipment manufacturers. The 2 F-18s that destroyed the U-35s returned to the USS Truman without any damage, landing on deck after a total flight time of 2 hours and 40 minutes, and Mitchell and his pilots were greeted with a modest celebration by the deck crew. This is because escalation must be handled carefully, as the situation can deteriorate in seconds from a routine interception to lethal combat. The Navy was aware that, although the tactical victory was clear, the strategic implications were complex. When questioned later, the pilots acknowledged that they had complied with the rules of engagement and only opened fire after the flanker illuminated them with a fire control radar, which indicated an imminent threat under the doctrine of self-defense. Telemetry analysis conducted by Ambram showed that, of the 8 missiles launched, 6 correctly locked onto their targets, while the other 2 failed due to the target's evasive maneuvers. A 75% success rate is considered excellent for effective combat situations against maneuvering opponents. If this in-depth air combat analysis between the Su-30I-5 and the Super Hornet helped you understand the difference between equipment capabilities and actual combat effectiveness, subscribe to the channel and comment on which country you're following from so I can tailor future content. This analysis presented a completely theoretical scenario based on technical capabilities documented in open sources. However, it does not represent actual events that have taken place. Important notice: this content is a fictional, simulated scenario designed to instruct and analyze tactics, strategies, and military capabilities documented publicly. Some visual or narrative elements may be generated by artificial intelligence, but they do not reflect real events or the official opinions of any country or institution.